Welcome, good day, good afternoon, or whatever time it happens to be. This is Connect Rather Than Divide Conversations. My name is Daniel Ludvigson, and I'm currently the superintendent of Long Prairie Gradyville Public School. I'm currently going on my 17th year of education, if you can believe that. So this presentation is about fostering positive connections and having conversations that build relationships rather than tear them down. I have another presentation that focuses on hard conversations, but this has a little bit of a different focus and is more about if you find yourself in a conversation that is not going the direction you want, or it doesn't feel like it's a positive one, or that you notice another relationship and conversation is having difficulty. So I'll talk about tips and tricks and signs and different things like that. And with that, let's continue. So these are two books I've pulled a lot of inspiration from about talking to other people about things they may or may not want to hear depending on the circumstances. And they're great tools and one of the few books I've read multiple times. I've also pulled from various resources with psychology and different things I've read and my personal experiences to generate this presentation. So one of the first things I want to talk about are the elements of a relationship. Now, I stole this from developing a romantic relationship, but the four perimeters for developing friendship are really just as applicable for just developing a positive rapport with somebody. And the reasons these are important is often your conversation with somebody will start long before you actually have a dialogue. And these are things that will build up a positive association done correctly. And the first three are the easiest on here. Proximity, that is just being around somebody or close to somebody. It's why the bus driver that you see every day that smiles at you makes a positive impact before you go to school. Now, obviously, that won't be positive if that proximity is paired with a frown or a nasty comment, but just being around somebody, even if they don't say much, as long as that interaction is neutral or has a slight positive, like a smiling face, will make that person more naturally comfortable with you because you'll be familiar. Frequency is just like what it sounds, is how often does that interaction occur? Like with the bus driver, that's every day. Is it every month? Obviously, the more frequently you're in connection, the more familiar you will feel with somebody. And if that connection is positive or neutral, that will provide a good grounds for starting a conversation should you need to. And duration is just the other side of frequency. How long is that interaction? Like an example of the bus driver, is it just a smile as you get on the bus, or you just sit behind them? Like how frequently are you in contact, and how long is that contact? One of the things I do with this concept is when I go over to the high school, I actually have my working desk out in the commons, and that's so people can walk by me. They see that I'm there. I'm in close proximity to them. It helps make up for some frequency, and I get a little bit of duration out of it by just being out there and available. It's also an example of when you have situations where casual conversation can come up, where it's not forced or overly formalized. Those conversations in the staff lounge are different than a set meeting, and it creates a little bit different space than even just a simple open door policy, as somebody can be walking by, have a thought, and then they have the opportunity to share it right then and there. The last one on these four dimensions is intensity, and that one is probably the hardest to control. I kind of briefly touched on it as far as if your interactions are neutral or positive, but what intensity means is what does the other person get out of it? If somebody's like a helpful mentor, I've had several mentors over the years, and I might talk to them once or twice a month, and the frequency isn't particularly long, and the duration in that context is not particularly long, but I get a lot of useful information out of those conversations. It's very helpful. There are even some people who, every couple of months or a couple times a year, I speak to on a topic, but they have a pretty high level of expertise, and so there's a high level of quote unquote intensity. So these are things that you can kind of think of as watering the plant. These are things that you can consciously do in order to develop a positive rapport with a group of people or a specific person so that they feel more comfortable with you, so that it's easier to have conversation. And the way I kind of like to look at it is if you have these elements in place and they're fairly strong, you have a little bit more grace when you do make a slip up or a mistake. And people are more inclined to assume a positive intent rather than maybe jump to a negative one. So the next thing I want to touch on is diagnosing the issue. This can be useful for yourself or for what you observe in somebody else. And I see it as four basic elements: safety, respect, purpose, and trust. Safety is just the sense that, you can talk to the person and you don't have to worry about your job. You don't have to worry about being harmed. Most of us aren't going to worry about being physically harmed with our conversations, but we might feel like you won't keep our confidence, or you'll go and tell somebody, or you'll retaliate. And that's just what safety is kind of getting at. Respect is the sense that the other person values your opinion, that they believe that you're competent in what they do and what you do. And I shouldn't say value your opinion so much as believe that you're well informed and have knowledge. And when you don't feel like the other person thinks that you are intelligent or know what you're doing, that can create a sense of disrespect. And I think a lot of us have dealt with that. And that can cause issues when trying to have a conversation with somebody. In particular, it can do a little bit of damage to your ego, and sometimes we have the urge to prove that we need respect, and sometimes that doesn't result in us helping any of these four items. Purpose. This one I find in education should be the easiest. We're all here to help kids. We're here to help the child that we're talking about in the meeting. Purpose is a sense that you're working towards similar goals, and it's an item that you can work on sometimes by taking where people are at and drawing a line of how they can connect. But when people feel like they're working towards different goals, that can be a source of frustration and conflict. And finally, trust. I know trust is most easily understood as, I can trust the person as what they say, they're honest, they have that kind of integrity. But trust is also how predictable a person is. Like, do you feel like if you talk to them that you'll be able to anticipate how they'll react? Do you feel like they'll consistently keep your confidence and give you that sense of safety, or are they, a little more untrustworthy one day and more trustworthy another day? Probably not the perfect word for what I mean right now, but like, if you're consistent, you stand by your values, people are going to feel like it's easier to know you, it's easier to anticipate what you're going to do, and they'll feel more comfortable having a conversation. So it's beyond just telling the truth, it's beyond being transparent, so to speak. It's also that your actions and your behavior are predictable in a sense. It doesn't mean you have to be the same everywhere in every context, but that person feels comfortable in knowing you. And so I have a story about this. I had two teachers once, and they were working with a student, and they were developing these fissures in their relationship. And it started off with disrespect, at least what they felt was disrespect. One teacher started to keep the kid a little longer after class to get their work done, and the other one felt like, you don't value my subject because you don't preserve my time, you take my time away. And that kind of delved into feeling like they had different purposes. They started disrespecting or not trust each other, like, you're doing this on purpose because you don't feel like what I have is valuable. And it got to a point where they were quite tense with one another, and it wasn't doing a lot of good. And so we got down into a room and we started meeting periodically where we had these conversations about, you do know quite a bit about special ed and what the child needs. You know quite a bit about business education, and that is important. Neither of you don't feel like that's valuable. You both want to help the child, so how do we do this? And as we did that, we developed more safety, more trust, and obviously the respect and purpose. But they never got to a point where they really enjoyed each other, but they got to a point where they could work and be productive. And that really took getting down into what's the issues between your relationship, what's causing these conversational issues. Because if you have fissures, like in this picture, you're more inclined to assume, like when you read that email, oh, that they're taking a dig at me. They have a problem with me. So that is those things. Now, like I said, this presentation is more so on if you find yourself in a conversation that's going not the direction you want, or to lay the foundations and to interact in a way that builds rather than tears down connections. But some warning signs can help you spot if things are going the way you want to or not. So one thing I like to remind people is a genuine conversation involves getting input and responding to it to see how your message was received. So first off, if you're in a conversation and words and actions aren't lining up, that can be a clue that something more is going on and maybe you need to dig deeper or ask more questions. Body language is another one where if what they're saying and their body language isn't lining up or their body language is just nervous. A good example I have is one time I had a parent come in and we started talking about their child and their needs, and they were very pleasant. The words were very kind. They were being very patient and respectful, but they were turning a very bright shade of red. And I asked the person, like, sir, is something wrong? And he said, no. And I said, that doesn't look like nothing's wrong. And I pointed out that he was turning bright red. And he also had his hands cupped and had very stiff posture. So I could tell, even though he was being very cordial, very polite, but something was intensely bothering him. Redirection or drilling down. Now, I find this one to be an example of a relationship fissure because I've been a principal for a while, and when I did principal work, I occasionally would, call a parent, say so and so had trouble in the playground, and if the parent started playing a game of 20 questions, like, well, who was on duty? What exactly did they did? What were their exact words? And just kind of going down and down. Or on the converse, well, what did Susie get for this same consequence? They did this, and you want to do this to my child. Usually that's a sign that they don't trust you or they don't respect, I shouldn't say you, but they don't trust something. And they have an issue with seeing either they don't respect somebody else's judgment or they feel like their needs aren't being respected or there's something at play there. And the reason they're drilling down is to find something to validate that feeling that supports their frustration. And the redirection is similar, but more of a push the issue off onto something else. That one's a little bit more victim. I'm a victim when you encounter it. All or none language. This is very similar if you're in a conversation and, teacher's always mean to my child. The principal is always picking on mine. Susie never ever does her work. All or none language generally means a person is simplifying the issue. And usually it's a sign that they're frustrated, and from that frustration they're making broader generalizations. And sometimes if you pull them back and say, well, is that really the case? Here are the facts, depending on the situation. And finally, be aware of your own behavior under pressure. I know I can start tapping a lot, my speech will speed up, and those are signs that something's bothering you. And if something's bothering you, your body will find a way to kind of put a signal out there. And if you're trying to stay calm under pressure and you have a lot of body language that is signaling that you're uncomfortable, that could result in your trust or the person feeling that you're saying what you mean to be called into question. And that may cause an issue with the conversation. It may also give you a hint that maybe you're heating up, and maybe you're getting to a point where the adrenaline might get you to say something you don't want to. And so maybe you need to take a break or a pause. A strategy I frequently used when I was a principal was a kid would be sent in the office. I could see they were very visibly upset, arms crossed, maybe mumbling something to themselves. And I tell them I was checking an email and I needed to finish it. And sometimes it really wasn't an email. I just waited until those levels came down and I knew that they'd be a little bit more reasonable. So I want you to stop and reflect. Think of a scenario where a conflict existed between two individuals. Diagnose it. What were the relationship problems that you saw? Like what might they be, and what outward behaviors indicated that the relationship was damaged? Um, and so, what elements were missing? You can pause the video. You can find a partner, but just stop and kind of think about those things we just discussed and how you've seen it in your own life. So, the only person in a conversation you can control is the man in the mirror, as the song goes. And a lot of times, the things that get us worked up or trip us up are actually the stories we tell ourselves or how we choose to respond to information or the damages in the relationships on our end that we're responding to. So, a great strategy first is to get back to facts. First off, if it's before a conversation, go through with yourself what things are actually facts. Because sometimes when we're frustrated, like somebody disrespects us, in our minds we'll be like, well, in this email, their tone was such and such, and that is because they disrespect me. They're always being that way. Well, if you go back to it and you read it through just kind of a neutral lens, is that what is happening, or is that just how you're interpreting it? A lot of times we'll start adding facts to things, again, to support how we feel or what we think is going on. When you're in a conversation, getting back to facts is a way to let everybody's temperature come down too, because you can talk about how, this is what happened and this what happened. We agree this happened. Those are less emotionally charged. People have to start thinking more so with their frontal cortex. And so it can even be a strategy to get people to relax. A lot of times we can agree on 90% of what is going on and then have our biggest arguments over the 10. So sometimes you can expand that even to, okay, do we agree on this? Do we agree on that? And like kind of, pointing out that you have areas where you agree and your purposes align. So that's a good place to do that. So a good example I have of this is one time I had a parent call me and they were just spitting mad, and they said they were in the grade book, saw that their kid got an F in art, and like I said, they were telling me that I can't decide what that art is subjective and whatnot. And I said, hold up. That was a error on my part. I missed a number. They got 100%. Missed the one in the score. So thank you for pointing that out to me. And if the parent had just started with what's going on here, because their kid did very well in the class, and a poor grade for me was not typical. But I apologize for my error. I own my own role. Probably not the best example of this, but if you're in a situation where you're justifying something, maybe you're lashing out, again, you're the only person you can control. So take a moment to stop and reflect on that. If you find yourself saying things like, that person never listens, the only way is to get loud and to attack back, it's probably a sign that you're using tactics fueled by frustration and anger that may not help you. Remember what you want to accomplish. A lot of our conversations, especially with the deflections or the drill down, will get off what we're trying to accomplish. A great example I have of this is one time I had a conversation with a parent. Their daughter had just gotten in trouble and was, I think, got detention or something like that. They came in and they were mad, and they said, if my son had done this, you would have suspended them. Why are you treating them differently? Basically said my daughter should be suspended. And I said, hold up, sir, are you advocating that I suspend your child? And he's like, well, no, that's not what I want. And I said, okay, let's back up. What are you really trying to say to me? And so this is good going into the conversation, or if you sense the conversation is trying to be veered off course, either bring it back to what you hope to accomplish or set your own mind right about being clear on, are you trying to build a relationship? Are you trying to point out an issue that needs to be fixed? What is it? And is your conversation working towards that? This can be great, like, firing up that email and you want to write your frustrations out. And, the kitchen sink, as I like to call it, when you include everything that's possibly frustrating you generally is not constructive for problem solving. It just serves to create frustration. And so in that example, focusing on a few things you really want to handle is more in line with what you actually want to accomplish. And lastly, you make you mad. How many times have you not talked to somebody because you've had the what ifs in your head? Well, they never listen. And if I say this, they're going to say something to someone, and they're going to be mad at me, and all these people are going to be mad at me. Those stories you tell yourself, like when you read that email and you're like, that has a negative tone. An example I have of that is one time I sent an email to a bunch of staff thanking them for punching in early and on time and coming in and working. And one of them sent an email back to me basically saying, this is condescending, you're trying to make a dig, be sarcastic. I went and talked to them. Because of their relationship with prior administration, they had taken that email negatively because that was how they were interpreting it. So something that COVID taught me was be very mindful of your language. And what I mean by that is, are you using things like we, us, together, ours, or are you using a lot of you, them, I, us, your? So if you're talking to a parent and you say, you know, we can help your child by working together. If we do this at school and you do this at home, their experience will improve and they'll be happier. That kind of stuff is very different than you're not working with the child. You need to do more. Not enough is going on. I can't do it all. I mean, last one may or may not be accurate, but if you constantly use the we, us together, it's going to send a message over time that that's what your focus is. To use you, them, I, very us versus you language, that's going to come through in time. So this isn't so much a specific conversation, but like for the administrators out there, when you're sending out correspondence, for teachers when you're communicating with parents, what are the words you're using on a consistent basis? Because that's going to be kind of back to that 4 quadrants of a positive relationship. What sort of foundation are you building? Are your words creating a strong foundation, or are your words creating a soft foundation, a place where you're creating them, us language, you know, inadvertently, unintentionally? Example I had of this is I had a board member once who, when he talked to me, he always used, and he was a good person, like, but he would always say, like, those teachers need to do this, you need to get on that. His language was always that way, and I noticed over time that that was the case, and so things that he said had a tendency to feel very pointed and very dividing. And like it's like the title of this presentation goes, these are conversations that connect. And so those words you use on a daily basis are a part of whether or not you're going to connect or divide in a conversation, because they're also your habits. And so when things do get a little bit more difficult, you're going to fall back on your habits. So another stop and reflect. Identify a situation in which you got worked up due to the story between your ears. Pick a situation where you had to communicate after telling yourself this story. Like, identify what messages your word choices may have communicated. How did the story you told yourself affect your word choices? What behaviors did you have that indicated how you were feeling? One thing I like to tell people is we need to get the story right in our head, because otherwise our body will find a way to communicate what we're thinking. And like I said, on those 4 elements of the relationship, that might cause an issue with trust because things aren't lining up that you're saying. So take a minute, consider that, and we'll get started again in a minute. So if you've considered the questions and took a minute to think about those things, we'll move on to the next point. So the bullet at the bottom there is always keep the focus on students. If you're working at a school, if you're on a school board, what you're trying to do is what is best for kids. If you're in an IEP meeting, you're trying to do what's best for the kid that you're talking about. And a lot of times these things I'm going to talk about are things that pull things off, or maybe are symptoms of something else, and you need not to internalize them, which I know is easier said than done. So connecting with purpose, emphasize that shared goal. During the COVID pandemic, I got very good in conversations with parents to say, I just want to teach your child. I want your child to learn. I want what's best for them. How can we do that? If you keep coming back to that, keep coming back to that. People want that. And so emphasizing that shared goal, which, like I said, you're there, we're an education institution. We're here to help kids. That should be one of the easier items to kind of mend in the process as far as those relationship fractures. Let people know you care. Again, telling, I care very much about your kid. I care very much about the school, whatever the issue is. I want the same things you want, using that language, repeating it over and over again. That lets you know that you have a mutual purpose, and keep revisiting that. Keep revisiting it. You might sound like a broken record, but that's okay. Use language that emphasizes your team. Us, together we can. That has to do with that language that you're using before that reference. Like, this lets the person know you're in it together, that you're working together on something, and kind of breaking apart the whole them versus us mentality. If you're working together towards something, if you're trying to mutually get to the same purpose, it doesn't really do a whole lot of good to attack you, to lash out at you, because you're not the enemy. But like I'm going to tell you with a few of my stories, a lot of times that people are confrontational, frustrated, or angry are because they feel inadequate. It's not about you. And that can be really hard in the moment when you feel like you're being attacked. But often these situations where somebody's expressing frustration, and even if it's heightened, are really about their own insecurities and the problems and frustration that they're facing. But they need an outlet for it. They need to be angry at something, because then there's something tangible to direct that energy towards. Otherwise, there's nowhere for the feelings to go. So maybe the person feels inadequate. I knew a parent, or several parents, you could say, over the years, who, they had a child who was struggling. Maybe they had ADHD, maybe they had autism, whatever it was. And I know some that, were single parents, so they weren't around to help much, and they felt bad about that. And they would call the school and be like, what are you guys doing? How can you help? And their frustration being expressed was really a symptom of not knowing what to do. And by calling, being frustrated and angry and expressing that, and they were doing something, they could feel like they had an action. Because despite being educated individuals, sometimes when parents call the school, or in other contexts, we don't really provide an answer. And so they want to find a solution. You're the person that's supposed to help them find a solution, and they're not getting it, and they don't feel equipped. We don't want to come into a conversation and say, I don't have the skill sets to deal with my child. You don't want to start with that. You want to take your frustration and channel it somewhere. So just keep that in mind. So that goes right into they want you to do something, and inaccurate assumptions. Another story I had was with technically a grandparent that lived with a mom of a child, and they had a mobility issue, which we'll get into. But I was getting calls, and the child was coming home saying that kids were flashing her. And you may not be familiar with kindergartners, but like in this classroom, at the front of the classroom, unfortunate placement, you could say, was a bathroom, and occasionally the kid would peek out and ask for help. Well, their underwear might have been around their legs. But the way this girl would go home and say this was like an intentional thing, that the child was flashing them in class, and I don't really think they were lying per se, but they thought it was a lot more interesting. They flared the story up and told it in a certain way. They enjoyed the attention they got. And understandably, Grandma was very upset. She repeatedly got these stories, and at one point she came in, we had a conversation, and it started very accusatory. Like, what are you guys doing here? This stuff is going on in your classroom. This is a mess. And as we got to talking more and talking more, and I kept saying, we're here to help your child. We want to do what's best for them. We're trying to find a solution. How can we do that? We eventually got to a point where she shared, she was supporting the household and she had to work 2 jobs, couldn't be home a lot, saw that her kid was struggling learning to read and different things, and was worried about getting him to school because the mom, as I referenced earlier, had a mobility issue and they had trouble. They worried about their kid getting what they needed to be successful. And then she got these stories, frustration, and she wanted to direct the frustration somewhere. And once we got to what was really bothering her, and we emphasized a shared goal, we got her into some after-school programs and things like that, it really changed the dynamic. It wasn't them versus us. It was like, how can we help the situation? Again, it's about the kids. That's why we're here. So some strategies that you can use. First one I'm going to start with is mirroring. It's a pretty simple concept. If you're all worked up and frustrated, you're going to send that kind of energy out. And if somebody comes in and they're frustrated and angry and you respond with frustration and anger, chances are you're going to ratchet each other's emotions up, and that's not going to work out very well. Versus if you use a very calm demeanor, that will kind of communicate that demeanor to the other person. If you use a very quiet voice, if you maintain that, you're more likely to see that from the other person in your conversation. Take your time. So one strategy I use sometimes is I'll just consciously slow my speech down, and that accomplishes 2 things. One, you generally sound very in control and you sound put together. It sounds a lot better than if you speed up and you start just to stutter and trip over your words, but it also gives you more time to process what is going on. So something came up and you're thinking, what the heck is this about? But because you slow down your speech, you're just giving your brain a little bit more breathing room to respond intelligibly. Be mindful of your body language. It kind of goes back to the mirroring your emotions. You might be doing a very good job controlling your tone of voice and that sort of stuff, but maybe your hands over here fidgeting, you're tapping, playing with things, moving around. That's going to communicate something. And if it communicates something different than what you're trying to say, like I said earlier, that could cause a person to question your truthfulness or to just be less comfortable with you. A specific strategy that is often very helpful is contrasting statement. I want to do X, I don't want to do Y. During the COVID, I had a lot of interesting conversations with parents, and one of my conversations involved, no, we are not trying to promote the liberal agenda and help the Democrats insert tracking chips into your child. We just want kids at school, so because we know that's the best place for them, and we just want to provide them an education. How can we do that? Sure, you can imagine that context. I was getting a call. They're very concerned that things are going this way and we're for this purposes. And like, no, this is my purpose. My purpose is to help your kid, aligning that. You might have to do that more than once, and sometimes it's a way to prime the pump, as you see there. I see X, a little off there, but you might have to guess at what the person has an issue with. And you might have to say, it seems like you believe this. This is what I'm trying to do. And that's a basic prime the pump strategy. And the purpose of doing that is to get somebody talking. You see that they're frustrated. They're not willing to talk about it. If they don't put it out there, you can't sort out the problem. Another way is to kind of paraphrase, but be very careful with that. And what I mean by that, use your own words to paraphrase it. If you repeat exactly back to someone what they said, first off, they could maybe see it as insulting, as maybe you're being sarcastic. Also, we have a tendency to use language a little bit differently. And so sometimes if we use the same language, We might not really understand what we're paraphrasing because they're using those words a little bit differently than perhaps we would. And so when you use your own paraphrase, it's more likely to catch maybe that, you're thinking one way and somebody's thinking another way. Again, these are to keep the conversation going. If you see body language that isn't lining up and a person's saying, fine, and you just kind of say, all right, which, sometimes you just need to give people space, but that can also be damage that trust element because people take that you don't really care, you don't really want to know, you just want the conversation to be done and move on. So stop and reflect. Identify a conversation you need to have or did have that involved powerful emotions. Identify the mutual purpose or goal. Identify the emotions that may be fueling the conflict. How do you create a safe place to talk? Because that's what these strategies are about. How do you make the person feel comfortable sharing? If you have somebody available, talk with them, write some note down, pause the video, and we will resume momentarily. So one of the big points in those books I referenced was creating a shared meaning. And I've kind of referenced this a little bit as I've talked. But a lot of people confuse giving information with communicating. There have been quite a few times where I've had a conversation, say, with a teacher where I'm like, have you been in communication with the parent? And they'll say, yes. And then when I ask a few more details, they'll be like, yep, I send a newsletter home every week. I put notes to them in the planner. And those are good things to be doing. And I'm not saying they're not. But they're not the same as having a conversation. And the difference is that parent is not really providing you feedback back. You're not really seeing how the message is being perceived. You're dispensing information, but it's not a dialogue. You're communicating information, but you're not dialoguing. And with shared meaning, we want to create a dialogue. We want to know that our message is being received, and we also want to understand where they're coming from. So all these techniques we've been talking about is trying to keep the person in the conversation, to feel safe enough to talk about what's on their mind and to develop those connections, and laying the foundation so that when you have these conversations, somebody doesn't just shut down and tell you everything's fine when what they're really thinking is, I just can't stand any of what's going on. So when you're in those conversations, starting with the facts is a great way, as I said before. It can be a strategy, first off, to kind of control the temperature. Like I said, it forces people to move more to their frontal cortex, out of the lower part of their brain where the emotional drivers are, and like focus on the information. And usually that part is not as confrontational anyway. Like, it happened on X day, involved these people, and it also gets out of the way of the information that you agree or don't agree on. It also helps you not to feed the confrontation. Like, a lot of times people, like in my stories, the frustrated parent is coming in and they're not going to listen to me anyway, so I need to be loud, I need to make a lot of noise, otherwise nothing's going to happen. Slowing them down and taking the time, especially use some of those mirroring strategies and stuff, will most likely demonstrate that you care, and caring really falls under that mutual purpose. Like, if they sense that we're working together towards something and you use that reinforcing language and you've set that foundation, the person's less likely going to feel like they need to direct their frustration at you, or at the very least, you can diffuse that desire. You cannot provide that easy outlet for that frustration to cling on to. As you get information from the other person, you're going to want to share how you're perceiving it. And the share your story and ask for their story, it can be flip-flop depending on the situation. But as you get information, it's sort of like that paraphrasing. So this is what I'm understanding. These are the facts you shared. And then you move on to your assumptions. So based on this information, I assume that you were very frustrated when you spoke to the teacher, and you used some words to describe that frustration that perhaps didn't go so well. and now we're meeting together, all of us. Is that about right? And the purpose of this is to, first off, create a clear separation between what things we already agree on, which things are determined as fact, and where your opinion is coming into it. So that you can be talking about one or the other, not kind of all mixed together, and be clear on what you're trying to resolve. Asking for their story is, taking that same information and saying, what are your assumptions from here? What are your feelings because of this information? Where are you going with this? An example I have of this that's kind of interesting was one time I sat a staff member down who had been sending people to the counselor, all suspiciously with issues with the principal, but not asking to be sent down to the counselor to talk to him about it. And I started with the facts of, during this period, so-and-so went down to your office and they were asked about so-and-so. So-and-so was talking to you and you encourage them to go to the office or go to the counselor and do this, and some different facts. And the person responded with, "Are you accusing me of something?" I said, "No, but if you had this information, what would you make of it? Is there an explanation for this that I'm not seeing?" And her explanation was to put in a resignation and quit the next day. So I guess that I should make ill of that, as I sometimes joke. But the point of asking their story isn't to get somebody quit or anything like that. It is if there's a way to interpret the information that perhaps you're missing a fact, a detail, or some part of the story that would change your understanding, or to understand where they're coming from, to understand if they have missing trust, missing sense of purpose, if there's some understanding that can help alleviate the frustration that you're experiencing in the conversation at the moment. And while you're doing all this, keep a focus on that shared goal, like I've been saying. Use that we, us language. Emphasize that we're here to solve the problem that you're talking about, whether it be like, better instruction, or to solve a student discipline issue, or to make better decisions as a district. Like, why are we here? These decisions need to be centered on this. Keep it focused on working towards that. You can kind of think of it like a mixing pot. You want to make sure all the ideas and thoughts are going into one thing, and that you're working from that same place rather than two separate places. Testing understanding is a good strategy to see if you're following along with the other person. Again, this is sort of like the paraphrasing, where you want to make sure you're putting it here in your own words. You tell the person, this is the information I have. This is what you're perhaps telling me, depending on the situation. This is sort of what I think is going on based on that. Like, it's sort of the next step past share your story, ask for their story. Does that sound about right to you? So you kind of go back to ask for their story, and you might move between those two and testing for understanding a few times until you feel like you have it. Again, paraphrase is a strategy to do that. And the purpose is twofold. One, to make sure you're still in the same pool of shared meaning that they have, that you're still thinking about and taking in the same information. And it's also to keep them talking, keep them being a part of the conversation where you're developing the understanding together. And then conversations that get tense, and this one's not about crucial conversations, but it might help you in a situation where the emotions are starting to run a little high, or perhaps something's making you a little hot. It's really important to end these with what's going to happen because we had this conversation. What is going to happen because we talked about this pool of shared meaning? What's going to happen because we have this shared goal to help this individual and these issues and these facts you brought up? Sometimes we have these conversations and we skip this part. We're like, we've all had the kumbaya moment. We've all had that cathartic feeling of releasing our emotions, and we go on our merry way. And then it flares back up when somebody thinks somebody should have done X, somebody should have done Y. Why didn't you change your behavior? An example I have this as I was having a conversation with somebody about a contract that the school entered into, and they were very upset, and they expressed why, and they had issues with the company that we entered into a contract with. And, we had a good conversation about it. I understand where you're coming from. But we didn't really create that clear path moving forward. So, a couple weeks or month, I forget how long later, I received another message being upset that we talked about this and nothing happened of it. You're still doing business with them. And our conversation with them, and I said, I understand that you're frustrated, and I do understand your points, but we signed a contract. We entered into a contract. We can't not do it. We have to carry through with it, and at the end of the contract we have options which we will pursue, but like in the meantime, like we still had to do the thing, but we are taking your feedback. Because we didn't really take time to dissect that, it created room for misunderstanding. And a lot of times the emotions that get high and hot are usually a difference between what somebody is expecting to happen, what did happen. That's what the accountability side would say of it. Or, like I said, that person is feeling an insecurity and they want to feel like they're able to do something, that they can take some action and it'll have an impact. And if they're not able to do that, or they can't think of a constructive way to do it, they'll just do something to sate that desire to feel like, like they're doing something about it. So moving forward, to get a little bit more into that, it's a very important step, because when you have a tense conversation, particularly if it does go down the path of a crucial conversation, it can be very emotionally draining, and you don't want to have those every other day. And it will certainly create trust issues and safety issues if people feel like, they have the conversation, they open up, but what's the result of it? Like, it creates that issue of, is anything going to happen because of this, or are we all just going to talk in circles? A good example I have of this is one of the districts where I started in. They had an RTI, now called MTSS, basically a student intervention program. And a teacher came up to me and said, we want to discontinue this. And I remember looking at them and being like, why? Like, it's a good program, research behind it, that sort of thing. And she provided a very good reason for why she was asking. She said, because all we do is sit around and talk, we take some notes, and then we have the conversation again next week. And what was missing was, how are we moving forward? So we had this conversation. We talked about this issue this student was going through, these problems. What are we agreeing to do because of this shared conversation, this shared meeting? Because sometimes you have to go back through the steps when you get to the actions, because what somebody thinks should happen because of what you talked about might be different than what you think should have happened, or you might be mediating that conversation with two other individuals. So important questions to nail down. And obviously this varies from context to context. For example, if you're having a committee meeting tasked with a specific problem, you probably want to write all this down. Where if you're having more of an informal conversation, you probably just want to make sure that's understood. So who? You answer who. Who's going to do something? So in my example of a parent who turned bright red when they were talking about situation with their kid, one of their issues was their kid was failing a subject, doing very well in other subjects, and they weren't doing their work. So how do I get them to do that? And so we had to find, well, the teacher is going to give them more math homework because they really liked math, but they didn't like, I think it was reading. If they get this stuff done, and at home, you're going to do this. Because if we didn't do that, it was a little unclear of like who was going to do what because of the conversation. And then, of course, the what. Like, did you define that? Like in my example was we're going to use this program, iExcel, and they can do the advanced work as a reward. Or if you're talking about a behavior, like we have kids that come late to class and we're going to assign a detention. That's the thing. That may or may not be the thing you decide to do, but if you don't define what that is, if perhaps you left the conversation and say, and we're going to prescribe a punishment, well, you may all have a different idea of what that exactly entails. Where, this depends on the context, but like sometimes where it's going to happen is important. Is it going to happen at home? Is it going to happen at school, for example? When? When is very important. You may or may not be a timeline driven person, but having a deadline creates an endpoint. So sometimes we have these conversations and we go through the who and the what and the where, and that's all sorted out, and we're very clear on that, but we don't touch on by when. And one person thinks it's by tomorrow, 8 a.m. sharp, and the other person thinks like sometime before the year ends. And that can create frustration and coming back. And, you know, if you don't define these things, sometimes when you have to revisit them, you've already caused the relationship damage. You already caused that questioning of, do you have the same purpose? Do you respect their time? Those sorts of things. So it's best to get that sorted out ahead of time, especially when you're not emotionally charged about those topics. And just as a specific check tactic, you need to do a check-in. So things with a longer timeline. So this is a strategy I've used quite a bit with, like, say, I investigated a bullying complaint that a parent had with a student had, I guess I should say, with another individual. I would tell both of them, I'm going to check in with you every couple of weeks. I want to see how things are going. And, if I have so many good check-ins and everything's going good, we'll stop with the check-ins. Can also be progress towards the end of a work completion. You don't always define these things, but like in particular, if it's an accountability thing, like an example of checking on the bullying situation, you do want to be clear that you're going to be doing it. If it's something more informal, less tense, like working toward the end of the project, it might be something you need to do. Perhaps you're the supervisor just to make sure things are moving along. And if you do need to have another conversation. But what this slide really does is like, okay, we have the conversation. Perhaps it got tense, maybe not, but like we had this shared meeting. Now what? If you don't define the now what, you might have wasted some good time, some good connecting. And if you have to keep revisiting it, you might not be able to undo the damage because you didn't take the time to do this step. So just to recap, this presentation has been about first, build relationships. Your conversation with people often starts long before you actually have a conversation. So are you connecting with that proximity or intensity? Are you using verbiage that promotes that we're in this together, that you avoid that them, us vocabulary? Watching for signs that the conversation is perhaps not going the way you want, perhaps the meaning's not being shared, or that there's some relationship problem underneath. Looking at that body language, realizing if you're being asked drill down questions that it might be a sign that there's a different problem. Focus on you. So you can't control the other person in the conversation, and fretting about what they're going to do and how to control what they're going to do is not going to be constructive. Admit to the issues that you contribute to. Focus on the behaviors. You can pay attention to yourself, as you will have your own warning signs that perhaps that you're not connecting, you're dividing in the conversation. Communicate a shared purpose. This is both before, during, and after. We're all working towards what? We're all trying to accomplish what? How are your words that you're choosing that when you communicate, even in, say, if you're a teacher in your student newsletter, how is that communicating it? If you're an administrator, when you're getting ready for a meeting, how is it communicated there? How you're reinforcing that we're in this together, we're connecting, we're not dividing. Shared meeting, just keep it in mind that when you have a conversation, the goal is to create an understanding that you're both kind of more or less agreeing to, or at the very least that you both understand where one another is coming from. You're working from the same pieces of information. You may at the end of the day still disagree on the implications of that, but you're not operating with missing pieces of understanding or like with a lack of perspective. And always remember to define the path moving forward. If we skip this step, if we kind of do it part way, we can sometimes waste a lot of good effort and time that could have otherwise been very connecting, could have been very strengthen the relationship, and now instead it's damaged. And in particular, if that happens repeatedly, it's really going to chip away in particular at that trust. and possibly respect depending on the circumstances. So again, my name is Daniel Ludvigson, and if you have any questions for me, my email is up there on the slide. And I'm the superintendent of Long Prairie Gray Eagle Public School. And with that, have a good day, good night, good evening, whatever time of day it is for you.